Thank you, Trish. So how do we stop this cycle of murderous violence, and how do we balance all the suggestions lawmakers and others have made with our basic civil liberties? It is an issue that has certainly divided us for years. But after twin shootings in El Paso and Dayton, Americans are now demanding action. So where do we begin? Right now, there are all kinds of proposals. On the gun control side, we have bans on so-called assault weapons. That's a dangerously blanketed term. Limits on the size of magazines and gun seizures and buybacks. There's also those dealing with mental health, including red flag laws, increased background checks, and shutting down online forums where would-be killers might congregate. That brings up some free speech issues, of course. Democrats tend to favor getting rid of the guns, and Republicans usually lean toward preventing lunatics from getting one in the first place. And earlier today, the president gave his opinion. Watch.
There's a great appetite, and I mean a very strong appetite, for background checks, and I think we can bring up background checks like we've never had before. I think both Republican and Democrat are getting close to a bill to doing something on background checks.
If only they had given Paul Manafort one of those. But the GOP is not entirely in lockstep on the issue. Today on the Daily Briefing, Illinois Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger said that his party has to compromise on some form of gun control, or there will be a, quote, serious movement to overturn the Second Amendment. Watch this.
As a Second Amendment guy, we have to be willing to say, what can we do to help alleviate some of these issues to preserve our rights? Because this next generation, I got to tell you, Dana, people think they're going to become conservative when they're older. They are very decided on this issue. And when they take power or they take a seat from me or something like that, it's going to be a very different outcome.
But is the issue of regulating firearms really at the center of all this, or just controlling people's access to them? Let's meet tonight's panel. We've got GOP pollster and Maslansky and Partners President Lee Carter is here. It should be Carter and Partners. We've also got criminal defense attorney David Bruno. Call him if you get in trouble. And features editor of Reason Magazine, Reason.com. It is Peter Suderman, Computerman. Welcome, everyone.
Hello.
So now we're kind of past the height of the emotional reaction to the tragic shootings, and now we can start to talk about what legislatively Congress has the appetite for doing. And it seems like every road you go down when it comes to adding to existing laws or creating new laws, you run into issues with civil liberties. What is being proposed that, in your mind, as a libertarian, is most rational?
I think it's actually better to start with what isn't working and what the bad ideas are.
Fair.
And you see on the right, because there are so many of them right here, you see on the right, you see President Trump blaming video games. There is no evidence at all. If anything, the evidence suggests a little bit the opposite.
And hasn't Ron Bailey pointed that out? And there are a number of studies that show that exact same thing.
Yes. And if you so since violent video games came out in the early 1990s, since they became a political issue, violence has actually fallen. Even youth violence has fallen. Then you look at red flag laws. Now, I know a number of conservatives like these red flag laws, but what red flag laws do is they say you, an individual specific person, cannot have your Second Amendment rights, and they often based on something you haven't done yet. They say that based on an idea of what you might do, and that's a really dangerous thing to do. And often the due process that people claim is in there it just doesn't happen. It ends up being a rubber stamp for judges. And then you look on the left, it's all gun restriction. And if you take the logic of the left to its end conclusion, what are they saying? They're saying there's too many guns, that simply the number of guns in America is the problem. Admittedly, it's true. America, there are an awful lot of guns.
Well, they also say, you know, if you look at Australia, they had a very robust gun buyback plan, but they started in a very different place.
Right. So violence was already dropping in Australia when that happened. That plan, the Australia plan, at most maybe bought back about 1 million weapons. In America, there are over 300 million weapons in private hands. Are you really going to get 100 to 150 million guns in a program like this? No. And even if you did, let's say even if you did, you'd still end up with 200 to 250 million guns in private hands. You'd still have a huge number of guns in private hands. I really just think that everybody's going down the wrong path here. Everybody's thinking about this as a guns problem, as a mental health problem. It's just there's a lot of bad solutions everywhere.
There are bad solutions, and there are bad people, and they do these horrific things. My biggest problem is with the assault weapons ban. Because, you know, again, that is a term of convenience that can encapsulate a lot. And usually it's thrown around by people who have never shot a gun in their lives. And they don't know what would fall into that category. They just know that certain guns they have seen, which might be, cosmetically altered, which don't affect how quickly a bullet can be fired or with what kind of accuracy, that is now scary and goes under that umbrella.
No, I agree with you. I don't think that is the answer to the assault weapons ban. I mean, let's think first about what can we do? What can we agree on first? Because we're never going to get that.
We can create a giant black market where guns are exchanged freely, criminally, among people who are willing to use them for harm and not for good and self-defense. Or
altered, like you said. I mean, a legal fire weapon could be altered. Look what we saw in the Las Vegas shooting. I mean, the manipulation of the gun for third-party market parts. But what can we do? I mean, first thing we heard from the president, universal background checks. Let's get that done. Right now, there is a bill that has been passed in the House that's in this, could be passed by the Senate. It doesn't look like that's happening. It needs to be tweaked a little bit, but that's first. And then red flag laws, right? That is probably the term I've heard most today. And it's really nothing new. Because most states actually have similar mechanisms for these red flag laws.
And there are 17 states that have them, including Florida.
New Jersey, for example, domestic violence. When there's an act of domestic violence, there could be a restraining order, ex parte, without a defendant appearing. A judge can sign the order where the weapons be taken away. But then there's a hearing within 10 days where there's a standard, where there's a due process hearing, and the defendant is there and has a right to cross-examination to make arguments. So it's really nothing new. But for it to pass the constitutional muster, it does have to be temporary in nature immediately.
Yes.
And there has to be due process hearing.
Well, due process, and also if someone makes a false claim, there has to be some punishment for that. There has to be accountability, because it's all too easy to say, oh, I heard this guy saying very threatening things, go take his gun. So what are we missing here?
What we're missing here is that only 14% of Americans think that Congress is going to do anything, and 90% of Americans want something to change right now. Congress is failing the American people, and if they can't find some way to compromise, when you've got 9 out of 10 Americans agreeing that at least we need background checks, 6 out of 10 saying we need a ban on assault weapons, I mean, we can debate whether or not that's the right thing, but there's no willingness. There's been no signal from me that on either side that there's any willingness to compromise. The left, with their rhetoric, by blaming Donald Trump and his bigotry and all of the things that they're saying, is making it almost impossible for a Republican to compromise with a Democrat. And the Republicans aren't doing any better right now. They're putting forward some things that I think there's no saying, like, you know what, we all agree that Americans need to be safe, that we should be able to go to a store and not be afraid for our lives. And Congress, they represent the American people. Do something. I think that's who's failing us the most. They need to get in a room and figure it out and stop with the crazy rhetoric and find a way to do something.
Stop with the political blame, because
it's unbelievable.
The Dayton shooter clearly wasn't a Donald Trump fan. So saying that the president causes this directly is a base and immature argument. Meanwhile, the political battle over the shootings, it's getting uglier by the day. The president was today greeted by protesters in both Dayton and El Paso, but before he left the White House, he said he's doing all he can to stop the hate. Do you believe it? Watch this.
I am concerned about the rise of any group of hate. I don't like it. Any group of hate. I am, whether it's white supremacy, whether it's any other kind of supremacy, whether it's Antifa, whether it's any group of hate, I am very concerned about it.
Today in Iowa, Democratic presidential frontrunner Joe Biden claimed that Trump is the guilty one. Joe?
We have a president with a toxic tongue who has publicly and unapologetically embraced the political strategy of hate, racism, and division.
All right, President Trump swinging back in a tweet. Quote, watching sleepy Joe Biden making a speech. So boring. The lamestream media will die in the ratings and clicks with this guy. It will be over for them, not to mention the fact that our country will do poorly with him. It will be one big crash, but at least China will be happy. Biden isn't the only Democrat criticizing the president, obviously. Mayor Pete Buttigieg tonight tweeting, quote, at times like this, it would be helpful if our country had a president. So profound. And El Paso native Beto O'Rourke earlier demanded the president cancel his trip there, and this afternoon tweeted, quote, Donald Trump has been very clear about who he wants to keep out of this country with walls and cages and militarization and torture and cruelty. we in El Paso have borne the brunt of that, but we in El Paso are standing up to that. Where's the solution in there, Beto? A lot of hyperbole and blah, blah, blah. Someone today on Twitter compared Beto to one of those giant windsocks you see outside car dealerships. They just sort of flap in the wind. Is the president damned if he does and damned if he doesn't? Suderman.
I don't think there's any there's no obvious solution for someone like President Trump here, right? And you know,
what he just announced, he just did what he's supposed to. He's like, white supremacy is bad, all hate is bad. I'm going to the places where people die to comfort them. And they're like, you should stay away and you should denounce racism.
On the other hand, he's now trying to say that the compromise solution is let's restrict immigration and guns, which is, you know, that
let's couple these two horrible ideas.
An awful event, a truly horrific, tragic event, and let's play political football with it. Let's just do what we were going to do already. Let's let everybody do it. I mean, in a weird and terrible way, it's a little bit like the bad budget deal we saw last week, which is Republicans and Democrats just agreed, okay, we'll all spend more on everything. You get your priority, I get mine.
Yes.
Obviously, it's it's a very different sort of underlying circumstance, but it's a very bad way to go about politics, to take a tragedy like this and just to say, well, here's a guy who said he targeted people because they were immigrants. Let's restrict immigrants.
Yes, and also I think that you end up crafting really bad legislation when you do it hurriedly and emotionally. And that's what a lot of Democrats were asking for Mitch McConnell to call everyone back from the recess. And it's funny because the Democrats from the Senate who are running for president are like, yeah, that sounds great, but really, they want to get knee-deep in funnel cakes in Iowa.
Yeah, when
rightly so.
When legislators react because of specific incidents, it makes bad law. I mean, let's talk about the conversation about domestic terrorism. First of all, that is not necessary to prosecute the defendant in Texas. I mean, Texas has the death penalty. He has killed, and he's going
premeditatedly.
Exactly. Yeah. We do not need a domestic terrorism statute to address that. So that's, I agree with you. I see, and listen, should he watch what he says? Absolutely. But I have a problem with what's happening now from the left. I see that rhetoric is similar to what they're criticizing Donald Trump of saying.
Yes.
I mean, it's heating up their side, just like it's arguably Trump's
They're not
words.
doing the opposite of what they're advising.
They're not going high.
And that's hypocritical. No, there's no high road here.
No, there is no high road. And it's really devastating because who's suffering now? The American people are suffering at the hands of this rhetoric. Yes, I mean, people might hate Donald Trump. They might think that they hate some of his rhetoric. I hate some of his rhetoric. It makes me crazy. But does that mean that we're going to be unwilling to make anything happen right now? It's absolutely beyond and baffling to me that it's better for them to sit there and start pointing fingers, calling things, getting people stoked up, getting the left totally to hate not just Donald Trump, but all Republicans now, because let's be very clear.
Yeah, but when you're busy hating someone, you don't have to come up with actual solutions.
And the fact that
that's been a very convenient scapegoat for everyone on the campaign trail, instead of putting out a 15-point plan for how you actually reach kids who are showing signs of violence in middle school and high school.
You have 20 Democrats running for president. You can't tell me that one of them doesn't have a policy that we could put forward right now. You can't tell me that any of these people have been running on saying that they want gun control for all these years, doesn't have a single idea that they can put forward right now.
Where's Elizabeth Warren's white paper? All right, we're going to see more of the panel very shortly. First up.